Hello, my name's Tom Smith. I'm a medical oncologist and director of palliative medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center at Johns Hopkins. As my colleague Mandy Gatesman, PharmD, and I wrote an editorial perspective in the New England Journal about the problem with the shortage of cancer drugs, really necessary cancer drugs. Sure, there are a lot of generic drugs in short supply, over 200, and it seems to be growing monthly and quarterly. It's come to a head with a shortage of critically important cancer drugs. They're not the fancy ones like Provenge for metastatic prostate cancer or new drugs. They're the generic drugs like methotrexate, leucovorin, which has helped to protect people from methotrexate, vincristine, generic adriamycin, generic paclitaxel or Taxol. The way cancer drugs are reimbursed is different than any other type of drug on the market. And this evolved really starting about 40 years ago, that cancer drugs were toxic, no one wanted to handle them, so oncologists began to dispense them from their offices. And we would have hoods, we would make them. Then about 15, 18, 20 years ago, this all changed with the advent of more for-profit medicine, so that we would buy these drugs and then sell them at fairly substantial markups to the patient or the insurance company, rather than just trying to choose the least expensive drug. This is unique to cancer medicine. There are no other medicines like this that are dispensed from the doctor's office. It's become an issue because it's a very lucrative practice. In most private oncology offices, probably 50 to 80% of the income comes from buying and selling these drugs. Without these drugs, oncologists like me are essentially just very slow internists, and we'd be paid the same as a geriatrician or a palliative care practitioner. Well, the great majority of cancer care is actually delivered in the community, probably 85 to 90% of it. And most of that is delivered by oncologists in private practice. There are oncologists like me who are paid a salary, and then there's often some incentive on top of that. And oncologists in HMOs like Kaiser Permanente and others are paid a baseline salary. That's really the exception rather than the rule for medical oncology in the United States. Most of us are paid by the number of patients we see, and then the profit we can make on infusing drugs and selling the drugs to someone. Well, there are shortages in most drugs and most generic drugs. Again, it's not the expensive brand name drugs, it's the generic drugs. So it's not just oncology. We're lucky that there haven't been any deaths that I could find or that Mandy could find in oncology. There have been 9 deaths, I think, in Alabama from a pharmacy that had to make up TPN when they couldn't get the right sterile product, and unfortunately it was contaminated. There have been deaths in the operating room and in the anesthesia suites from people choosing the wrong sedating agent or the wrong paralyzing agent when what they used to use wasn't available, so they chose what was on the shelf. In oncology, we have this triple or quadruple check system, so that hasn't happened yet. We're at risk, I think, of possibly people dying if they can't get some of these essential medicines, but it hasn't happened yet. But this is really just in oncology where people buy and sell the drugs, and that's been one of the big issues. If you're a generic drug manufacturer, why would you make a drug for which you don't have a market? If the oncologist like me can dispense a $2,000 drug and get 6% or 12% or 20% of that back on top as margin, why should we dispense a $200 drug when we can dispense a $2,000 drug? That part is unique to oncology. Sure, we mentioned several examples. One is the L-isomer of leucovorin. The medical letter reported when this drug came out that there was frankly no reason to use it because there was never any indication that it was better than plain racemic leucovorin, and really no proof at all, and yet it went from being a $0 market to a $41 or $42 million market within a few years. And that was because oncologists thought they were doing the right thing, and they could also make substantially more money by selling an expensive drug rather than by a generic, really inexpensive drug on which they were probably lucky to break even. So that's one example. Another example is generic paclitaxel versus the nanoparticle albuminized protein-bound paclitaxel. The hope was that this drug would be safer and easier to use. It doesn't require as much steroid beforehand. The hope that it would be better and be less neurotoxic. That's still a completely open question, and in fact the Cancer and Leukemia Group B has a big, large, randomized clinical trial right now trying to compare those two drugs to see if one is better than the other, because the answer isn't in. The generic paclitaxel is a few $100s for a dose. The nanoparticle albuminized protein-bound Abraxane is close to $6,000 per dose. If you're an oncologist and your practice is worried about revenue and you can use both, you get paid 6% of the drug. So should you take the 6% of $300 or the 6% of close to $6,000? And we see practices dividing themselves up by their practice patterns. Some use almost all of the generic paclitaxel, and some use almost all of the brand name Abraxane. I would argue that there's no scientific reason to choose one over the other, and I think the National Cancer Institute and the Cancer and Leukemia Group B would back that up. Well, the generic drug manufacturers are interested in doing what I would do if I was making a product. They're interested in selling it. So they're going to sell it at the price they can get and move as much volume as they can. They're not setting that price at $3, except as it's come down. And Dr. Alan Lichter at the American Society of Clinical Oncology gave the example of carboplatin, when it first became a generic, was $135 a vial. And so 6% of $135 was enough to justify the oncologist keeping it in storage, having some of it go bad, having to return some of it, preparing it and then not being used, some nursing time, some pharmacy time, some bookkeeping time, all the office expenses. So 6% of $135 would cover that. But then the price continued to fall with the average sales price methodology in place by Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And it's fallen to $3.50. Now the 6% of $3.50 is pretty trivial. It's probably multifactorial for what was pushing the price down. It was a good market opportunity, so more manufacturers got in and made it, and then suddenly you have an excess supply, and so they're trying to lower the price. And the way the average sales price works, it's adjusted every quarter based on what the average sales price was. And if that continues to go down, it continues to go down each quarter. There isn't an easy methodology in Medicare to allow that price to go back up. It has to stay at what was the last quarters and the last quarters before that. So we may have to rethink that whole methodology. Doug Blaney, who was former president of ASCO, now at Stanford, just published a letter in the Wall Street Journal saying that that's really much of the fault, is the average sales price methodology. That we need to have a way that that goes up and down to reflect actual market conditions, rather than only being allowed to go down and having to wait an entire quarter to go back up.